This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Juanita Stephen, who teaches in the Department of Interdisciplinary and Critical Studies at the University of Windsor in Ontario. Her research is guided by feminist theory and its methodologies, draws on the insights of care practice and community work, and is focused on questions of gender, family, and children in a Black studies frame. In this conversation, we discuss the relationship between Black study and care, how childhood and care networks inform theory and writing, and how the past and future of Black studies engages with community life and its everyday practices. Hello, Juanita. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Really nice to be chatting with you. How are you doing today?
I'm great. It's Friday afternoon. It's no longer summer weather outside, which in this part of the country, it's been in the 90s for a while. So good weather, end of the week, all of that. And it's my birthday month, by the way. And so all good things. But really, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I was so happy when we got in touch and found a time to talk. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on the field of Black studies, sort of how you think of your own work in relation to it, and what you think about the past and future of the field, and all of these kinds of questions we talk about in the podcast. But I think before we talk about those kinds of questions, I wanted to start with a personal question and just ask you to kind of narrate for us how you got interested in the study of Black life. So what drew you to that? What's your sort of origin story in relation to this field of study, interest in Black studies, and always for me, the interesting question of what sustains your relationship to the study of Black life and to the field?
Yeah, I think that my journey toward and into Black studies was a bit of a windy and twisty one. I kind of went around the side and came in the back door. So my education really started out with me wanting to be a teacher. I've always wanted to be a teacher. I thought I was either going to be a kindergarten teacher like my mom or an English teacher. So I started as an English major, and I was pregnant with my son pretty early on in my education, and then went and did some community programs where I was a service user in the social service industry and kind of stayed on as a peer mentor. And that opened the door for me to leave the English program I was in and go into child and youth care. And so I was educated in this very, emerging professional discipline in Canada. You can study child and youth care at the diploma level, like in a community college, 3-year diploma, or you can do a degree or a graduate degree. And so I did all three of those. I did a diploma, and then I worked for 10 years in the field, and then came back and did an undergraduate degree. And in that time, I also started teaching kind of sessionally in child and youth care. And in that teaching and practice phase, I was beginning to kind of notice that there were some tensions between what I was being asked to teach as care and what I was asked to practice as care, and then what I had learned from my own upbringing and my family and my mom, who's an early childhood educator, and my community and my church. I grew up in the Black church. So there were all of these, kind of different aspects of my life that I was kind of learning about what care was and what it meant to take care of people and children in particularly, and to value them. And so as a child and youth worker instructor, kind of sessionally at that time, I was teaching courses that were already established. And in there were kind of, these moments where I would encounter points in the curriculum where I was like, this doesn't feel like care, this feels like violence. This feels like surveillance. This feels like, why am I teaching students to call the police on children as a last resort? Like, why is it in this context at all? And so these sort of these tensions really kind of created this space when I went back to school to do my undergraduate degree in child and youth care so that I could make more money really doing the same thing. My supervisor for my undergraduate thesis was telling me that the questions that I was asking were, grad school questions. These are things that I could pursue in a PhD, which I had not even considered doing at the time. Grad school wasn't even on my radar. I was going to do child and youth care. I was going to teach, or I was going to do something that was in line with what I was already doing. But I had these questions that were brewing. And so I applied for a master's in child and youth care and did that. It was a 1-year program. And while I was there, I really got connected for the first time with a number of Black professors who were helping me to further the questions that I had about the interaction between child and youth care, social work, social service work, and Black communities, Black children, Black families. There was, what was being called care and what we were being asked to do as care. That tension, they really helped me to kind of open that up a little bit. And so then I started to think about what would a Black feminist spin on child and youth care look like? That was kind of the question as a master's student that I was asking. And so when I decided to go into to apply to PhD programs, that was kind of the question I was holding and trying to pursue. And then, so in 2018, I started a PhD in gender studies at York. So this was the first degree that I took that wasn't in child and youth care. Up until that point, I was very disciplined, if you will, super disciplinary education up until that point, focusing right on child and youth care. But when I started in gender, feminist, and women's studies and started to think more about kind of Black feminisms and care work, the courses that I was taking, for the first time, I was taking courses that were Black studies courses. The Black feminisms course, it was the first time that I'm studying Black feminisms formally. Before that, it was just, kind of what Catherine McKittrick would call a clandestine degree in Black studies, that I was just reading books on my own. I was asking questions on my own. But in my PhD, I started taking actually Black studies courses that allowed me to put language to things that I already knew, and that allowed me to find ways to ask different questions about these tensions that I was seeing between what the institution and the state, my professional training was calling care, and what my community and my family, my people were doing, how we were practicing care. And so that really opened up for me the possibilities for Black studies and actually encountering it for the very first time. So I came to Black studies late, 6 years ago. I just got here. And it's been a really kind of steep learning curve, and just, voraciously trying to read and study. But it positioned me really well for my doctoral work, which really kind of explored some of those tensions and kind of allowed me to step in understanding my work as a project of Black study and Black studies.
So, look, I love this question because I just find people's journeys into the field so interesting. I mean, it's, we don't arrive as, essay writers, right? We have a human moment, right? It's so interesting that you started and you said you have this sort of in through the back door sort of winding journey. But as I was listening to you, it sounded like this, it was like immersion that found new ways of making different interventions, right? It's like the practice of care, sort of, the way you talked about finding problems in that and asking new questions, and sort of coming to the studies part of Black studies as a different form of care, or a different sort of way of dealing with this question of care, because I'm glad you've talked about, I'm sure you'll talk about it more as we go along, about your interest in care work, right? As not an offshoot of Black studies. You've already sort of told that story. It's not an offshoot of Black studies. It's sort of what envelops Black studies, and the way I heard you talk, it was like Black studies sort of operating within this envelope of care, but doing it in a particular way. And you're finding ways to do that, right? Rather than, you know, that's why I say the sort of interest in the study of Black life, right, and Black studies, because the relationship between those two can be its own topic. But the way you folded those two together in that narrative is totally interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that once I got to my PhD, I was able to find language that situated the knowledge and the practice that I had been engaged in really for most of my life. I was finding the language to make that make sense in an academic context as I understood it.
Yeah.
And so it really, Black feminisms particularly and Black studies more generally was, I was really kind of understanding what that was, what it was to call what I was doing Black study or Black studies, to make it make sense within that context, even though it was something that I had been engaged in for some time. Yeah.
That phrase, finding language for it, is I think it's such a common thread in these conversations, like finding language, and where is that language found, but also how does that experience of care work actually put a demand on the language you're looking for, right? You can't just hand me language; it's got to answer to something. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's really what I ended up studying in my PhD, is how those discourses can obscure different things, and how language is working, particularly in the register of care.
And so maybe this is a good segue then to this next question, because I'm thinking about, what is that language accountable to, right? And how are you accountable, or any scholars accountable to certain, places and peoples and communities? Because really that's at the origins of the story of Black studies as an institution, right? That it has two origins, right? One is an intellectual question of what does it mean that universities didn't have adequate, if any at all, study of Black life, right, in the traditional disciplines of history, English, etc. And so there was that campus demand for the intellectual work that Black studies does to articulate, extend, understand the Black intellectual tradition, diasporic traditions, and so forth. But there was also, at the same time, at the founding of Black studies, a different kind of political demand that Black liberation struggle was putting on campuses, putting on classrooms, putting on curricula. It was really redesigning the relationship between those things, right? Of thinking about, if there's going to be a study of Black life on campus, it's going to be answerable in some ways to communities. And so that, for me, is like a tension at the origins of Black studies, one which is an intellectual demand to describe Black life, the other is a prescriptive demand to make Black studies something that enhances or enables Black liberation struggle. But that's 50-something years ago, and so here we are in 2024, and as you say, you're feeling fresh to the field, so I'm really especially interested in that sort of fresh eyes on the field. To ask you, this is a long way of building up to this question, how do you imagine the field in 2024, specifically in relation to this tension that's at its very founding?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that tension is, that it can be a productive tension, and I think that it is often, and particularly thinking about Black feminisms, like a Black feminist studies, which is really the way that I kind of situate myself within Black studies more generally, is really concerned, I think, with maintaining both of those trajectories, right? Both of those pieces, and keeping them in tension. Like, it is the praxis of thinking about what is what is the thought, what is the knowledge that can be produced out of the practice, out of the political work, out of the coming together outside and inside, and transversing the porous boundary of the university, beyond the paywall, beyond the classroom, and in the classroom, right? So I think that inside and outside of the university, in conversation with and in relationship with the community, as a part of the community, that all of that political work that makes knowledge, that makes this tradition, this intellectual tradition that continues it, that furthers it, that keeps it going. That has always been very interesting to me and very resonant, again, because of the way that I come into this. It's always been about practice first. I was the person who in my first year of my doctoral studies, in every class, I was like, okay, this is very, like, it's a cool thought experiment, but what does this mean in practice? Like, how do we move this out of our heads, out of the page into like the world? And people had to keep saying, just like, stay with the thought, stay with the idea, the theorizing. And these weren't not necessarily in like Black studies classes, right? But just in like a methods class or a theory class. And it doesn't do me any good if it's only a thought experiment. For me, this is how I kind of came into it. And so I think that Black studies really holds those two things together. It's not useful for just kind of an intellectual thought experiment if it isn't helping us to think about what liberation looks like in practice, like how we actualize these ideas, how we implement, this knowledge, and how that implementation or that practice or that living can then continue to further the knowledge. So I think that tension and the reciprocal nature of that is still very present, even in 2024, as it takes different shapes, as we find these, different nooks and crannies and ways to study that are intentionally against or, the purposes of the university proper, TM.
University proper TM. I like that. Might use that myself. I have a few conversations this afternoon about the university. So anyway, sorry. But that implement is such an interesting question. You said how does this implement? How does this intervene in the political world? And it is interesting the different ways that we can hear that kind of not commandment, that's too strong, but that prescription. Like this has to return to liberation struggle in some way. And I think the way we articulate that as Black studies scholars and teachers is always going to be really interesting. Like, what does that mean? And hearing you respond to my first question about sort of how you got to this field, what drew you to the study of Black life was, when you said sort of finding that language and sort of like, what does that language then do to practices of, as you were talking, care networks and care practices, but also in political struggle. And that's a hard question because it's not just writing for a popular audience. It's actually, it's hard in one way, but it's almost embarrassing to call it hard and then put it this way, which is that's just what it means to think that this stuff is about people's lives, right?
Yeah, exactly.
About the humanity of the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that keeping that in view at all times really can inform the trajectory of the work. And I'm using the work to think about all of this together, the whole project of thinking and doing and being and moving towards liberation. The area that I worked in professionally for 17-ish years was in child and youth care, which, describes itself as doing a kind of a relational practice, a therapeutic practice in the spaces where children are living their lives. Oftentimes those spaces are mediated spaces, schools, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of everydayness of the practice is really resonant. And so, thinking about Black studies, right? Thinking about moving towards liberation, thinking about kind of a Black intellectual tradition that can inform that sort of practical work. It is always about the doing. It is always about, how do we think about creating supportive and like structures that are not carceral? How do we think about listening to children and valuing their opinions, as June Jordan demonstrates? How do we teach and move into classrooms in ways that are transgressive, as Bell Hooks has told us, right? These things are always, for me, about tangibly like making life better, about making life a little bit freer. And I do that with often some of the most vulnerable people in our society, which is children and young people who aren't often called to participate in the making of thought. And until they are, right? Until we say, actually, children have a lot of great ideas. They haven't been disciplined into thinking that there's one way that you have to think about things. Their minds are open, they're expansive, they're Black, right? And so for me, I see all of these as really part of like naturally flowing together as we think about liberation and try to practice it.
And I think, there's what part of what you were talking about there also really struck me, the way there's such a deep political statement made when you think about what is worthy of thinking about.
Absolutely.
When you say like young Black children, right? Are these worthy, their practices, their play, their ideas, their lives, right? Are these worthy of thought? So even that moment, the political question of like, who do we listen to? Who do we look to for our own sources of thought, our own sources of reflection, whether it's, what's a real cultural object worth talking about or what lives are worth talking about. And I think like there's been an emergence, in the last 10, 12 years of Black girlhood studies. And I think there's been such interesting stuff to come out. But aside from the interesting stuff to come out, I was just really struck when it came out, sort of started to emerge as a field, subfield. I just thought, this actually reframed for me like this question of like, we make such deep political decisions when we decide what's worthy of our contemplation. And I'm just repeating what you said, but I find this stuff really moving, both emotionally moving, but also intellectually moving to think hard about our choices that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those, the questions that we ask, the areas of study that we engage in, what we consider valuable, those are not insignificant decisions or valuations that we put on things. They shape how things then move forward. What's the next step after we decide that this person isn't worth listening to? We move in another direction, and that person gets, or that whole area, that whole possibility is foreclosed, right? As opposed to if we decide that, let's think a little bit more in this direction, and then we open up these possibilities. So they're not insignificant at all, and I think really worth underlining.
It's amazing to think too about just a few decisions and how they set a whole trajectory that people spend decades working on. I talk about when I teach James Baldwin, I teach a seminar on Baldwin's nonfiction pretty regularly. Now I always say at some point somebody could have said, and it could have trended in intellectual life and publishing life, to just say, why would we listen to James Baldwin? He didn't even go to college. But somebody said, no, let's listen to James Baldwin, and now look what we have, right? I mean, so these decisions also set out these trajectories, and I think about things like Black girlhood studies, like what's that going to look like in 40 years? Because somebody just said, actually, these jump rope games tell us a lot about the origins of Black culture, and I was like, yeah, and then all of a sudden it becomes a whole subfield, and from there, yeah. So it's the politics of the moment, but it's also what then decades down the line. I mean, I've been in academia since the early 90s, and so I'm like, it's amazing what these little decisions do, and all of a sudden 20 years later it's a whole field of study.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of my work pulls on like family and like informal archives and whatnot. And I remember, when I first encountered like some albums that my mother and my grandmother had made, and using those as kind of points of reference, I remember thinking like, wow, my grandmother didn't even know what she made here. She didn't even know how important this was, because, she had made these for me, and they were just family albums. And those are very easy to discount as just like important to the family and the end. But Black studies taught me that, that we can kind of and think about how, we value different resources as intellectual or worthy of study or worthy of consideration. And in doing that, it opens up this whole other alternative history of thought, as Harney and Milton would say, and making the decision to value that, making the decision to spend time with those subjects or those texts or that, textile or those games or that braiding hair practice. Again, it continues to open up. And like you said, if someone had said, why are we listening to James Baldwin? He didn't go to college. He didn't, we don't value things that don't hit this certain kind of like academic rigor or measure by this particular ruler. We foreclose so much. And, Black studies just continues to open up all of those doors for me.
So maybe in some ways you've gotten quite a ways down the road to responding to this question. I love that, and I love the family album standing as something worthy of thought, something intellectual, right? A theory, an idea. So, in some ways that's kind of probably embedded in this next question, which is, thinking about your own work and your own curiosities in relation to the field of Black studies, its past, but also its future. That your work is invested in you've talked about it in care networks and gender studies, feminist ethnographic approaches, historical studies. And so when I think about that and listening to you talk so far, I wonder if you reflect on your own approach and your own interests, how you see that in relation to the past of Black studies, right? How does it fit in the Black studies tradition? But maybe just as much or not more, how do you think it opens up new horizons for the field?
Yeah, so I think that like my work, I said at the beginning that I was like, I'm going to be a teacher. And so my work has come back around to think about pedagogy, to think about teaching and learning, to think about the spaces where that happens, and particularly where and how we learn what care is and how to do it, and how we teach and learn with care and as a practice of care. So teaching and care are all kind of tied up in each other in the work that I do. And I think that there's a long history in Black studies of education being a political and transgressive and a careful space, and being having to happen in nooks and crannies and in all of these spaces that we make and create. And so I think that it falls in that lineage in lots of the things that we know that have been published about, again, referencing those same folks, Bell Hooks, June Jordan are some of the folks that come to mind immediately. Of course, there are many, many others. But it kind of falls into that line of, it's not just teaching a thing, but it's practicing the thing that it's teaching also, right? It is this praxis, pardon me, the objects under study, what it is that is given the space to be explored, curiosity, all of that really comes into my work. I'm more interested in perhaps writing about teaching as opposed to like teaching a class in order to make it a book, right? How do I create a space, a classroom, an object that will facilitate an opportunity for study are really some of the questions that I'm thinking about. And how do we do that in a way that is careful, caring? I'm really thinking about care as a practice of world making, how to make this world one that we can live in, that moves towards life always, that doesn't foreclose the opportunity for Black life. So I think that my work really falls in that lineage because it is curious, that it is always trying to think of like, what else can we make together? What else can we gather folks together to know that, like, the sum of its parts are, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It is, it's expansive, it's creative. A lot of times I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to end up. And I think that that is also part of Black study. And Black studies is not having a predetermined outcome, but trying to engage differently, to ask different questions. And so, McKittrick and Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman, there are all of these different ways that they have demonstrated that what form can do and what genre can do in terms of being both pedagogical and curious and careful at the same time. And so I'm just really right now at this point in my career trying to stay curious and trying to allow myself the space to engage with students and engage with texts in a way that that keeps that space of like curiosity and teaching and caring all kind of wrapped up together in order to see like what else is possible, especially as when I have students in my classroom. Right now I teach in an interdisciplinary and critical studies department. And largely I have a lot of like gender, feminist, and women's studies students, social work students, first or second year undergrad students who are going to go into education, pre-service teachers, that sort of thing. So a lot of those students are going to be thinking about like working with children. They're going to be thinking about teaching, are going to be thinking about those sorts of questions that I've been thinking about for the last kind of 20 years and how to do this interaction with people, this relational practice. And I really want my work to be oriented to supporting students to think about that work differently, right? To like not discipline themselves into being soft police, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about kind of Black feminist abolitionists thinking. Dorothy Roberts really helps to kind of think through that, and a number of other folks. But I think that that's where my work kind of falls in that lineage is really trying to take up some of that mantle, a lot of the lessons that are there, and just practice them with students in real time, so that they could kind of develop their own kind of critical consciousness and thinking with some of the questions that Black studies and Black feminist scholars and practitioners and activists and artists are asking and thinking about.
So listening to you, it strikes me that that's both the origins of Black studies, right? So much of what you're talking about. I mean, that's, as you said just now, it's like, this is what the field sort of wants and has enabled, but it's that curiosity part that's always that new horizon, because the curiosity, especially this many years out from the origins of Black studies has, I think, really been able to move away from always having to justify itself, and to fully embrace that curiosity and experimental dimension. So I loved hearing you talk about that, because it also, the unstable and chaotic and unpredictable thing that happens once you start to think about your ideas and values and so forth in motion, right, in a classroom or in any kind of conversation. That's dynamic, and it has built into it new horizons, right? Who knows what will emerge? And that's something that becomes possible. I know that, there's a lot of reasons to be worried about the institutionalization of something like Black studies that's been an outsider from its origins. And how do you become complicit with systems that maybe you want to be more critical of? But the way you were describing, what's, I was listening and I was like, oh, this sort of this new horizon. You're like, as June Jordan talked about, right? Or, as Bell Hooks talked about. So going back to canonical figures and foundational figures in the tradition, it's like that way that the origins and open-endedness maybe it's not as much of a binary as I asked in the question. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a different shape. Maybe it goes in circles or waves, or travels back and forth. Maybe time is collapsing on itself. Maybe there are layers, but I think that the origins of Black study is an opening, right? And that we continue to open other openings, and it's important not to forget the lessons that have been learned, but to build on them, even as we kind of push back against this need to continue to do something new just for the sake of doing something new, as the institution demands of us.
The institution does demand that. That's for sure. So, I mean, this is in some ways just a continuation of your comment, and to ask you, having done a PhD in gender, feminist, and women's studies, and now working in interdisciplinary and critical studies department. I love the name of that department, though. I don't know quite what it is. I haven't looked at the curriculum, but immediately I wanted to be a part of it. I love that, interdisciplinary and critical studies. I was like, this is my language. But that means that your doctoral work and now your teaching and research work as a professor, neither of those are in disciplines. And so I'm curious how you think that not having had a passage moment through a discipline, or a tension between a discipline and an area study, but really moving through these two programs, has affected how you approach the idea of research and writing, but also how it impacts how you construct a classroom. Because disciplines have very specific ways of constructing classrooms at the broadest level, but also in terms of the way we interact with students. But area studies, it often is a different classroom. So both research and classroom, how do you think this, the way you've moved through two different area studies has impacted how you imagine those two places?
It's a great question, because I really am trying to remind myself that I can approach this in many different ways, both my teaching and kind of like my scholarship otherwise, my research and kind of knowledge production in that way. It's so open. And so I think that's where I kind of take some of my liberties with kind of being creative or curious or experimental. Yesterday there was I taught a class, and there was an assignment that was due, and I said, this is an experiment. Like, I don't know if this will work. So we're gonna try it out. We're gonna see if you learn something, and if I learn something, and we'll try to do that together. So I think that not having a discipline, but having that kind of extensive professional background in terms of the social services, I think those two things come together quite a bit in what I do. And so because and I think there's a few other things. So I think that child and youth care comes into it. So it's very relational. There's a lot of engagement. I want to hear back from you. I also grew up in the Black church. So there's a call and response that I'm looking for. I can't just talk. I need to know that you're there. But then there's also a certain kind of style of teaching that comes from watching Black preachers for my whole life do a particular type of storytelling and making it accessible to whoever might be in the audience. I kind of think about that. I think about my mother as an ECE who said, she went into being an ECE because she said people needed to listen to children, that she saw someone on the bus, a child was trying to speak to them and they didn't listen. She said, I want to be that person who listens to children. So these are all of the lessons that I bring with me into a classroom and into like a program of research that's really concerned with like how power is working, how it organizes our world, how it figures some of us outside of the space of knowledge producers, of those who should be engaging with knowledge production, who should be reading things. And so it shows up there a lot. If you were to actually look at my doctoral research, like my dissertation, the last chapter of it is like a YA anime, like a illustrated book that re-articulates the disproper in language that my son or my mother or like a practitioner or someone could pick up and read and understand what the dissertation is about, but it's written through the form of a story about a young boy who in his community, they created another model for learning, teaching and learning and studying that's focused on, that's oriented around kind of principles of Black study. And he's trying to figure out how to tell a story about care and how to do that with care, right? But it is the disproper. So it shows up in my work in this way, right? It's like, who am I in relation to? Who am I accountable to? Who's my audience? Not as someone I'm speaking to, but that I'm in conversation with. And so I think that those things come together. And so it's not like disciplinary. I haven't been trained as like an English person, or as a philosopher, but I have been kind of disciplined in this way, and I have all these other influences. But it allows me to really kind of move sort of freely. And the thing that I have to really push back against is kind of this institutional pressure to produce something in a way that is legible to the institution, to the academy, which I'm not particularly interested in doing. So
this last chapter, you have to find a way for that to be in a book or in a digital project or something. That's amazing, actually. Are you an illustrator, by the way?
No, I worked with an artist. We kind of collaborated. I gave him the idea, Joe Bonsu, and he drew the images and then I annotated them. And so I used some of these methods that I was theorizing and engaging with in the dissertation to annotate and redact and so I was practicing Black feminist writing strategies that practice care to do the theorizing of that work. So it was collaborative.
You might get people trying to look up your dissertation. 'Cause this is totally interesting, but well,
I know. It will become something more, but yeah, it's out there.
Everybody who's written
Can't
a
hide.
dissertation hesitates before looking at any dissertation. But most people hide their dissertations. So you're like, no, this is really fantastic thing. Go look at it. Well, let me ask you sort of big, broad question. What do you think that Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah, this is a question that you ask people on this podcast, and I always think, how will I answer that? And I think that it's
by the way, most people definitely are like, do I have to answer this?
I know.
But they answered their own question, which is part of the design. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I think it's done many things well. I think that the way that I can answer that best is to identify what it has done well for me, which is help me to understand things I knew and to make clear how much knowledge exists beyond the university. I think that Black Studies has done a really good job of highlighting how a Black intellectual tradition of rigorous study, of collaborative study, of diasporic knowledge production, conversations that are happening, across peoples differently situated across the world, that manner of knowledge production is not only valid, but it is critical to understanding the world and doing anything to change it. So I think that has been really helpful for me in noticing that, even though perhaps the thing it doesn't do well is to do that consistently, or to kind of keep that in its view that we've done this already. There's already a history of this. This isn't, this is something that we can remember. We don't have to create it again. We don't have to figure out how to do it again because we've done it. There's models for how it has happened and how it has been useful. How have people struggled? How have people won? We don't have to, recreate everything all over again. So I think that that kind of cuts both ways, that there is this long history that teaches us and reminds us to look beyond sometimes what's right in front of us, which, like, it's really hard to see anything beyond the walls of the university when you're inside it sometimes, right? And it's hard to remember
It's
that,
a
like,
job.
it is a job. It is a job. And that, like, in doing community engaged research is not about being a researcher inside the university who recruits 5 people to, like, say something, but it is about building relationships. It's remembering that, like, actually I'm a member of the community first, and this is a job that, perhaps these things that are affecting me in this way, like, I'm on both sides of it. And then what it doesn't do well is to make us believe that we're only on this side of it. The more it becomes institutionalized, the more it kind of takes up the mantle of DEI, the more it kind of becomes part of that process of just kind of actually becoming in service to the university. Then we forget that lineage, I think, sometimes, or we lose sight of it.
I love that. That's thank you. That was really thoughtful and interesting. And I love the way it's like, maybe what we don't do well is what we've always done well, which is it's a hard response to take on, but in some ways, because it puts it right at our own doorstep, just not far away, the thing we haven't done well. It's intimate, but those are the best kinds of challenges, I think. Well, let me ask you this question about sort of futurist thinking. What would be an index of the ultimate success of Black studies, right? Because Black studies has really changed the way disciplines work. I mean, English departments, history departments, sociology departments, they're so transformed by Black studies over the last 50 years, and there's so much work, Black studies kind of work, done in disciplines. Is the success of Black studies to eventually have transformed those disciplines, continue that work to the point where we're not really needed as Black studies, right? Because now the study of Black life is where it should have been all along in these disciplines. Or is the success of Black studies to develop itself as something closer to a discipline, something that it's like, well, this is Black studies. It can't be just distributed through what we've always known to be a university structure of disciplines, right? So it's really sort of, do we change the disciplines, or is it to become so distinctive? And are we already there, perhaps?
Or a secret third thing.
I always like secret third things. Yes, please.
And which is not even, it's not a secret. I think that, so I'm not invested in Black studies, or like maintaining the disciplines or changing the disciplines. And I think that Black studies is most successful in its traversing discipline, is its refusal to adhere to discipline. It's the knowledge that those distinctions are artificial, and that when I'm thinking about Black life over here, it is also connected to everything, everywhere, all at once. And so I don't know that there is a singular marker of its success, but to continue to resist the many ways that it can be institutionalized and used to just further the project of the university. I think Black studies is most successful when it is working towards something else, not inclusion in a particular place, not reform of a particular thing, but towards otherwise. I think that is its most successful. So a new university, a different university, something that is not a university, ways of teaching and learning that aren't about capitalism and reproducing those structures. Like, can I teach Intro to Black Studies with community members who are not paying tuition? Can I be teaching about Black life in prisons in a way that is actually meaningful to the folks that are in there, and that is useful in some way, that it's undoing things. I think the more it undoes, the more successful it is. Does that answer the question?
Wow. That really answers. I love that as a third option. I love, how to split differences or chart an alternative route to questions. I always love that as as a conversational piece. But that takes us in a really interesting direction. And I have to say, it reveals, I mean, you've mentioned Bell Hooks and June Jordan a few times. It reveals, for me, like their deep influence on how you reframe this, because, the idea of transgression in Hooks is so much about that, but it also is different because you're speaking from inside and, also outside the institution at the same time. I love this, like, it's not just to be unassimilable to disciplines, but it's to be otherwise in university life as university life. I love that. No, that's my new answer. No, I'm serious. I'm going to go listen back to this. People have to wait a few weeks for this to come out. I'm going to go back and listen to this. Well, let me ask you as a final question. What do you think is the question we in Black Studies should all be asking? What is the thing we should all be thinking about today?
What else is possible? And I think that is just like on every register, and it's a question that people are already asking. Like, it's not a new question, but I think it is like a central question that, can scale up and scale down, that can, be applied in every context. I feel like that question is central to Black studies. What else is possible? What else is possible for Black life? What else is possible for the way that we teach and learn? What else is possible for the systems of care that we create in order to take care of one another so that we can survive this world until it is no more? What else is possible in the way that we relate to one another? What else is possible in terms of building infrastructure, systems, modes of trade, like ways of cultivating land, ways of collaborating with other folks? Just what else is possible? And if it's not possible now, how do we get to a point where it's possible? I just think that question continues to open up possibilities. Well, defining word with a word, right? But it continues to open up
I know what you mean.
These doors and exits and opportunities and ideas and particularly asking it with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, not just asking the person that you always collaborate with and that you work with, like, what else is possible for us to do on this next book, but like, what else is possible in the way that, Dr. Eve Tuck asks, like, what is your theory of change these days? There's a short essay that she wrote that asks that question. Like, what else is possible? I feel like is the question that I return to, and I think is important to Black studies as it is being asked, and I think it should continue to be asked.
I love that. That's a really great place to end, and a really exciting place to end, because I think what else is possible can come out of a place of desperate need. I think it does for people who understand how broken and difficult the world is, but it's also a place of such pleasure because it really accesses what's best in us, which is our imagination. Right. Our imagination with each other. I love the way you put that with other people, not just in the shower or out for a walk by myself. So I love that. So this has been such a fantastic conversation. I was really looking forward to talking with you and hearing about your work and your thoughts. And this has been so much more than I was even imagining. So thank you for your time and for this really like genuine thoughtfulness. I think there's going to be so much for everybody who listens, so much to think and to talk about with other people. And I know that's what you want. And absolutely, that's the effect of this with me, right? Listening to this. So thank you for your time. And thank you for what this really gives all of us to think and talk about in the future.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come on and chat with you today. I've really enjoyed it. And I love the podcast, and I can't wait to listen to all the future episodes as well.
All right. Well, I appreciate that too. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.